This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can visit their store by using my referral link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Nitahone, and today is Wednesday, and that means it's time for the 43rd edition of my deck history series. In this series, I trace the development of a particular competitive archetype from its origins to the current day. As is usually the case for this series, I ran a poll last week that let the viewers decide the topic of this video, and in the end, mill decks beat out discard decks. Mill decks get their name from Millstone. This is an artifact that you could pay 2 mana and tap to put 2 cards from your opponent's library into the graveyard. I have the original printing of the card on the screen so you can see what it looked like when it debuted, and you may have noticed that it doesn't say it taps. Back then, there was an entirely separate kind of artifact called a mono artifact. You can see that on the type line here, and that meant you could only use the ability once each turn and tap it. So a tap symbol wasn't necessary, it was implied by the type back then. Anyway, Millstone was the first card with this type of effect, where you directly take cards from the top of an opposing library and put them in the graveyard. And mill stuck around to refer to effects that put cards into the graveyard from the library. This was just a slang term for a really long time, but in 2020, it actually became the official term for the effect, and it now appears directly on cards. Mill decks are decks that seek to eliminate the opponent's library and take advantage of the fact that you win the game when your opponent goes to draw a card and has none left in their library. This video is going to focus on decks that mill the opponent and not on self-mill decks, which are a whole other thing. If you're interested in that, there are a few earlier editions of deck history that look at decks that are in this self-mill category, like the one that covered Dredge. This video is divided into 3 sections that talk about different types of mill decks. First, we're going to start with control decks that look to win the game via milling. These are the most plentiful kind of mill deck throughout the game's history, but there are some other varieties too. We'll also take a look at 2 combo decks that can win the game in a single turn by milling the entire opposing library, and we'll also take a look at the 1 creature-based mill deck that has shown up in the game so far. I should note that I chose not to include storm decks that win with brain freeze because storm decks are going to get their own video at some point. Alright, so we'll start with a look at mill control decks, and we'll start with the deck that started the mill train, and it featured the mill card that started it all, Millstone. 2 blue-white control decks featuring Millstone top-aided Pro Tour New York in 1996, including the deck that won the whole event in the hands of Michael Lecanto. As you can see, Michael's deck really doesn't feature a win condition aside from the aforementioned Millstones. It features Blinking Spirit, but that's basically in the deck to block forever, but doesn't do much attacking. Obviously, that is a very slow way to win the game since Millstone only mills 2 cards at a time. This deck has a ton of iconic, powerful spells from the early days of the game, including powerful board sweepers like Wrath of God and Balance, and one of the best spot removal spells ever, Swords to Plowshares. The deck also runs counter magic in the form of the original counterspell. The deck also features a pretty sweet engine of land tax combined with either Ivory Tower or Zuran Orb. In conjunction with either of those, the deck could gain a ton of life. This deck was basically a buzzsaw against creature-based decks, and Millstone was really all you needed to get the job done. Ever since this deck took down Pro Tour New York in 1996, control decks that feature mill as one of the main ways to win have shown up periodically throughout Magic's history. However, it would be more than a decade before another deck with the mill focus found success at a significant event. At Worlds in 2009, Joel Calafell piloted a standard Turbo Fog deck to an undefeated record, and the deck's only win condition was milling the opponent out. While it has a whole bunch of different cards than we saw in 1996, the basic game plan is the same. The deck runs powerful board sweepers, removal, and counter magic, as well as life gain. The big addition was the addition of fog effects. You can use fogs to make the game go long by blanking opposing attacks with them. In this case, you use Angel Song and Safe Passage. This makes the game go longer and gives you time to try to find win conditions and more ways to continue to make the game go on. The turbo part of the deck's name comes from the deck's plethora of extra card draw, like Howling Mine, Jace Beleren, and Font of Mythos. Notably, these all provided symmetrical card draw. This was good for the deck because it could allow you to draw a whole bunch of extra cards, which meant you would find more fogs or time walks or board sweepers, while also picking away an opposing library. You and your opponent were both drawing cards, so you had to make sure they ran out of cards first to win, and this could be achieved with Jace Beleren's ultimate as well as Archive Trap. Most decks ran multiple cards that searched the library, so casting the Archive Trap for free was pretty common. This type of mill deck didn't find a ton of consistent success in Standard, but it was a factor in the Standard of 2009. 2013 would be the next time we saw a mill control deck emerge. The Standard of 2012 and 2013 featured several control decks that could win the game by milling out the opponent, and of the decks featuring that strategy, the most all-in on milling was Ben Stark's Esper control deck, which top-aided Pro Tour Gatecrash in 2013. His deck leans on Nephalia Drownyard, a non-basic land that could function as your win condition. That's always really sweet because there is no real cost of running the card in your deck. It doesn't take up a slot in the way a regular card would, since it's a land that can actually produce mana until you get to the point that you want to use it. Like every other deck we've covered so far, it also has board sweepers, removal, counter magic, and life gain. One particularly notable card in this deck is Sphinx's Revelation. This card is a control mage's dream because you can draw a ton of cards with it while also gaining a ton of life, and when X gets high enough, it's a pretty tough card to beat. This deck does run creatures and could certainly win with Restoration Angel, but it won way more games by milling out the opponent than it did by attacking. The next major mill control deck would show up 2 years later in the Standard of 2015. Michael Majors won Grand Prix San Diego that year with his blue-red control deck, which featured Sphinx's Tutelage as the primary win condition. Tutelage mills 2 cards every time you draw a card, and you even get to repeat the process anytime you hit 2 non-land cards, which happens a pretty significant chunk of the time. This was an impressive mill engine for a control deck, since such decks, of course, already love drawing a whole bunch of cards so that they can continue to keep the game under control. This deck leans even harder on card draw, for obvious reasons. Casting Treasure Cruise or Magmatic Insight could mill a huge number of cards. The deck's only creature is Jace Vryn's Prodigy, a creature who loots, and he transforms into Jace Telepath Unbound, which, like many Jaces, has an ultimate that will mill the opponent out. The deck remained a factor in Standard throughout 2015 and 2016. Every control mill deck we've talked about so far has been a Standard deck, but we still have one more to talk about, and it's in Modern. Mill decks first emerged as significant players in Modern in 2020. By 2020, there had long been a bunch of sweet mill cards in Modern, but it was only the printing of Ruin Crab and Zendikar Rising that finally pushed the deck into a more competitive realm. Now you could combine Ruin Crab with Hedron Crab, and if you have both in play, you get to mill 6 cards for every land you play. While the deck certainly has some control elements, it is the most all-in on mill of any deck we've covered so far. It doesn't just run a couple of different sources of mill. While the crabs are at the center of the deck, it also uses Mesmeric Orb, which mills a player anytime a permanent becomes untapped, and Maddening Cacophony, which is kind of underwhelming in the early game, but when you can kick it, it does some serious work. Archive Trap, which we saw earlier, is also featured in the deck. These blue-black crab mill decks continue to be a factor in Modern today, with a top 8 at a Magic Online Showcase Challenge as recently as February of 2022. So, that covers the major control mill decks in the game's history. Let's take a look now at combo decks that look to mill the opponent out in a single turn. Both of the decks in this section are played primarily in Legacy. The first of these decks to emerge was Painter's Servant. Painter decks have been a pretty big factor in Legacy ever since the eponymous card was printed in 2008's Lorwyn. The Servant has what seems like kind of a silly effect. When you play it, you get to name a color, and it lets you make every card on the battlefield and every card in every deck that color. However, when you combine Painter's Servant with Grindstone, you can one-shot your opponent's entire deck. However, when you combine Painter's Servant with Grindstone, you can one-shot your opponent's entire deck. Grindstone was long thought of as a pretty awful card, but Painter's Servant changed that. The Grindstone mills 2 cards and then checks to see if those cards shared a color, and if they do, it mills 2 more cards. If you have Painter in play, you've made it so the entire deck shares a color, including its lands, so the entire deck gets milled in a single activation. Combo decks built around pulling this combo off have been a factor in Legacy ever since 2008. The deck is largely made up of card draw and tutors that can help you find the combo pieces. For example, this version has Imperial Recruiter to find Painter, and because a Recruiter can also get Trinket Mage, it could also pretty much tutor up your Grindstone. If we fast forward all the way to the Legacy format of 2022, you can still find Painter decks. As you'd expect, the deck has changed some in the last 14 years, but Painter and Grindstone are still at the center, and the deck still just wants to get them in play as quickly and consistently as possible to mill out the opponent's entire library. There's also one other mill combo deck that can be found in Legacy, and those are Helm of Obedience decks. Decks really focused on winning the game with a single activation of the Helm are a relatively recent comer in the format. So, Helm of Obedience lets you pay X mana and tap it. When you do, your opponent mills a card, one at a time, until they end up with a creature card or X cards in their graveyard. If a creature card ends up there, you sacrifice the Helm and put the creature on the battlefield under your control. That's a cool effect and all, but Helm of Obedience combo decks don't ever actually care about getting a creature. Instead, they combine the Helm with effects that don't let cards go to the graveyard, like Dauthi Voidwalker and Leyline of the Void. Because of how the Helm works, after each mill it checks the graveyard for one of two conditions, and if they aren't there, it just keeps milling. So, with the Voidwalker or Leyline in play, it just mills the opponent's entire library because none of those cards are going to the graveyard. While Helm combo has been a factor in Legacy, it was usually as a secondary win condition in a variety of decks like Painter combo. It was only the relatively recent printing of Dauthi Voidwalker that really made combo decks focused on this strategy a thing in the format. Alright, we only have one more mill deck to talk about, and it's another pretty recent one. It's the only mill deck on the list that usually wins the game by attacking, and that is the Standard Rogue mill deck, which has been around in Standard since 2020, and is still around to some extent today. For a while, I thought I might not include this deck since it doesn't usually win the game from the opponent drawing a card from an empty library. However, it is a deck that wants to fill the opponent's graveyard with cards, but in this case for bonuses that make the deck's creatures better. And I thought that would be an interesting thing to look at alongside all of these more traditional mill decks. As you can see from Seth Manfield's deck, the deck runs 12 creatures, all of which mill the opponent. Soaring Thought Thief mills 2 cards every time it swings, and once there are 8 or more cards in the graveyard, it pumps all your rogues, including itself. Thieves Guild Enforcer mills 2 cards anytime it or another rogue enters the battlefield, and it becomes a 3/3 with Death Touch when there's enough cards in the graveyard. And Vantress Gargoyle is an impressive 2-mana 5/4 flyer, but in order to attack, he needs your opponent to have 7 or more cards in the graveyard. So, basically, this is a spin on a tempo deck. These creatures aren't unlike Delver of Secrets or Nimble Mongoose in other formats. They're cheap to play and quickly get big and can win the game all on their own, while you remove creatures and counter spells. But to do it, you have to mill your opponent some. The deck also runs a few other cards that pay you off for all that milling. Drown in the Lock becomes more potent the more cards that your opponent has in the graveyard, and Into the Story becomes a very cheap draw spell once you've milled them some. Later rogue decks would switch out the Gargoyle for another rogue who likes the graveyard to have cards in it, and that's Merfolk Windrobber, a 1-mana 1/1 flyer that can give itself up to draw a card when your opponent has enough cards in their graveyard. Ruin Crab is also in the mix in more recent versions of the deck. This actually makes milling the opponent out more of a possibility, while also setting up all of your rogues quickly. This deck is still around on the fringes of Standard today, though most of it is rotating out of Standard in just a couple of months. Before we close things out, I should note that there is another mill deck in Standard right now, those built around Tasha's Hideous Laughter with a game plan of copying it with Galvanic Iteration. This deck has seen a bit of success, but none of it has come at the highest level just yet. However, this deck doesn't have any of its key pieces rotating, and it could be more of a player in the future after rotation. So that's the history of mill decks in Magic the Gathering. We've seen a lot of them over the years, and we're likely to see more in the future. If you enjoyed this video, please like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch future editions of Deck History, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. If you want to catch up on the more than 40 other episodes of Deck History, you should see a playlist on your screen shortly. And if you want to go the extra mile in supporting the channel, you can by using Patreon, by becoming a YouTube member, or by buying Nitsahone merch. You can find all of those things in the description. Thanks for watching.